There's one debate the world just can't seem to settle: climate finance. Who pays, how much, and with what strings attached? It's a tug of war rich and poorer nations have been locked in for years.
What is happening here is mind-boggling and absolutely unprecedented.
Coming up, the new study saying polluters can actually afford to pay, even though they claim they can't.
The 6.6 trillion means that there's enough to pay the climate finance bill, but also address issues at home.
And while the money fights rage on, another study is saying global warming is pushing us to consume more sugary processed foods.
Wow, very nice.
Plus, Brazil might not be ready to host the world's biggest climate conference in November. Construction's slowing down as workers strike over pay.
E helicóptero dando voo rasante em cima da gente, para quê? Para pressionar os trabalhadores a não paralisar e para apoiar a patronal a dar essa miséria de R$20 de aumento.
And there's a debacle over the soaring price of hotels. Just 2 degrees is on. Now.
Certo? Então como é que os preços estão absurdos e quase todos estão lotados?
Let's talk about sugar. The word alone and these pictures stir cravings. A silky chocolate dessert, an ice-cold fizzy drink, a smooth scoop of coconut ice cream.
If I'm honest, I can't even have a cup of coffee without it. Sugar fuels us, right? Even comforts us at times. But it's also got a dark reputation. It's blamed for obesity, diabetes, even addiction. So what is sugar really? And why does it have such a grip on us?
At its core, sugar is simple. A carbohydrate built from glucose, fructose, or galactose. It's the body's most basic fuel. Every heartbeat, every step, every thought runs on sugar. Without sugar, our bodies would simply stall. When it comes naturally inside fruit or grains and wrapped with fiber and nutrients, sugar fuels us steadily. Bite into a banana, for example, and you feel it. That quick lift in energy, sharper focus. It even brightens our mood. That's sugar at work. But refine it, pour it into sodas and sweets, well, that's when the trouble begins. Too much of that kind of sugar can lead to obesity, diabetes, and even heart disease. The conversations around sugar can get confusing. Some say all sugar is poison, others swear certain fruits are bad for you. But many scientists agree that when sugar comes with the good stuff, fiber, vitamins and minerals, the body can handle it. It's the industrial added sugars flooding our diets that can make us, well, unwell. So sugar is both friend and foe, both comfort and temptation. The real question isn't if we eat it, but how much we eat and where it comes from.
And that brings us to a new study that suggests that global warming is making us consume more sugar, and it's hitting disadvantaged groups the hardest. Let's touch base with COP 30. There's a bit of drama with this one. Who am I fooling? There's drama with every COP. But the annual climate summit is less than 2 months away. And host country Brazil is still not done with its preparations.
And here's why. Workers have been striking, which is slowing down construction of the Leaders' Village, which is meant to house heads of state. The strike began on September 15th, and based on the local construction union, their beef is all about pay.
A posição do governador tem sido de repressão aos trabalhadores, é colocar a tropa de choque, a Rotam, o batalhão de ação com cães e helicóptero dando voo rasante em cima da gente. Para quê? Para pressionar os trabalhadores a não paralisar e para apoiar a patronal a dar essa miséria de R$ 20 de aumento.
Meanwhile, there's drama around the cost of hotel rooms. Our team avoided the high costs because we booked months in advance, but several nations' delegations as well as civil society groups say the price of hotels is shutting them out of the conference. It's a big topic in Belem, the Brazilian city where the climate conference will be held.
Certamente quem quer luxo teve a oportunidade de ir à COP em Dubai. Quem quer viver a experiência da Amazônia terá a oportunidade de conhecer Belém.
Mas a exigência era que nós fizéssemos diária de R$300, R$500, certo? Como se fosse um dia comum na hotelaria, certo? Que os hotéis se sacrificassem para atender um grande evento, coisa que não acontece em nenhum lugar do mundo, certo? Mas Belém tinha que ser assim. E é lógico que a hotelaria recusou.
É como diz, né? É um evento mundial, é um evento de uma magnitude que Belém nunca esperou. E assim, os valores acabaram ficando desordenados, né? Todo mundo colocou seus valores. Até hoje tem pessoas que estão cobrando valores assim que são fora, né, da realidade.
Eu acho que esse pessoal está em outro mundo, porque estão pedindo preços aí exorbitantes, que o pessoal de fora aí, o que está acontecendo, as pessoas, até o governo do estado está sendo desmoralizado, porque não acompanhou, ele não acompanhou os aluguéis. Aí os caras estão explorando muito. Eu não vou cobrar um preço absurdo, cobrar o normal, entendeu? Para poder usufruir da casa, as pessoas que vierem de fora.
Certo? Então como é que os preços estão absurdos e quase todos estão lotados?
One of the hottest debates at COP30 will once again be climate finance. Not a new fight, I know, but long story short, countries that cannot afford the annual climate disasters that hit them are demanding trillions of dollars from nations that are most responsible for the crisis. Global North, countries say, sure, we'll help you out, but it won't be the amount you asked for, and it'll come as a loan.
Meanwhile, several civil organizations over the past year have been insisting that European countries, the US and the like, could actually mobilize around $6.6 trillion annually for climate action and other global priorities. Bronwen Tucker, Global Public Finance Lead of All Change International, will break down that figure in a minute. But first, here's what the organization's We Can Pay For It study found.
Hey, Bronwen. So $6.6 trillion is massive, but what would you say is really standing in the way of countries raising taxes on the super rich or cutting fossil fuel subsidies?
Yeah, I would say, massive number. And it really could do a lot of good if we were using that money intentionally and taking it away from some of these kind of most harmful actors like fossil fuel companies, like billionaires. But I think ultimately it comes down to power. And so we've seen over decades the kind of policy orientation be towards trying to kind of support corporations to make bigger profits. And that's due to, really intentional lobbying from the oil industry and others. I think a lot of that kind of facade that that's actually good for society has really crumbled. So, we do see momentum where, we name there's 18 countries that have put in windfall taxes on the kind of record oil and gas profits that we saw following the pandemic. There's great leadership from global South countries to push for fairer global tax governance or global debt governance. So there is momentum, but there ultimately will need to be a lot more. We need to be pushing our governments to put in bigger ideas.
If fossil fuel subsidies disappear, doesn't that mean energy bills could spike for everyday people? I mean, how do you make sure vulnerable families don't end up worse off?
It's a great question because it's really an issue that's dear to my heart. I would say so for fossil fuel subsidies, the kind of a big chunk of that is production subsidies that are upstream and really targeted at benefiting corporations. But as for the ones that are more on the energy bill side, that's where it's really making sure that what we spend this money on goes to things that benefit everyday people. So that can be wealth redistribution and just giving and having a more equitable tax structure. It can be things like public transit, affordable healthcare. And I think if you're spending that money properly and with people's interests in mind, then it won't have that regressive impact. But I think that's where the kind of design of how you phase them out is really key. And of the total, it's just about 331 billion. That's the stop funding fossils part of it. So it is also a relatively small part of how we get to that figure.
And with higher taxes on the ultra rich, how do you stop the money from just running away through tax havens or clever accounting, for example?
Yeah, so that's where there's lots countries can do at the domestic level to design that policy well. There's also great data showing that kind of effect of how much wealth kind of leaves the country, is able to leave the country when you put in a policy, has been really overstated. And you can imagine that kind of narrative has really been put forward by the super rich to try to, stop these taxes from being put in. There's also a really great momentum towards a UN tax convention. So in August, 2 years of negotiation started, and that was really pushed for by an alliance of small island states, African countries, and they've brought together most of the world. There's just 8 countries, most of them in the global north, that are kind of blocking momentum towards those fairer rules. But that would be the kind of ultimate answer that we should be getting to, of having rules that actually kind of at the global level that can start some of that, stop some of that tax evasion and just shuffling funds. Yeah.
So your organization's proposal even suggests trimming military budgets by 20%. That's bound to spark a lot of pushback. How do you defend that, particularly in such an emotional and volatile global climate?
Yeah, I think there is, we do have to be sober to the fact that the military budgets have continued to climb. And so it's not a case of, that this has been a neutral pathway. There's been such intentional spending to bring this up. And I think that's where you really have to think about, is that working? I think it's pretty easy to see it's not actually creating a more secure or peaceful world. And so we can look at, I think the kind of other half of this equation of this study is looking at all the things we could be spending on instead. And that's where, the climate crisis is one of the biggest drivers of war and conflict as it creates so many disruptions. And you can look at things like development and education. And I think also there's a good case for, just knowing that spending this money has really created more damage than good, and really looking at intentionally ramping it down. Yeah.
Do you think governments might take climate finance more seriously if it were framed as a security issue, something that protects national stability the same way, I guess, armies do?
Yeah, I think it's an angle that's really underexplored. We can see even with countries that have been able to do a bit more of a transition to renewable energy, they're much less dependent on the global oil price. They've been able to have more kind of stable energy economies, even when it's 10% or like a small amount of the energy system that's transitioned. And I think there's a similar dynamic with a lot of the spending that's needed for climate before you even get to the benefits of reduced emissions. Yeah.
So when it comes to the actual bill, how do you figure out who pays and how much?
Yeah, so that's where I think the bottom line is to just get against the argument of scarcity overall. The 6.6 trillion means that there's enough to pay the climate finance bill, but also address issues at home. And I think that's where, so there is a lot of options. And I think above all, really trying to get out of that kind of scarcity frame. That being said, there absolutely needs to be democratic rules. And that's where I think some of these multilateral pushes for having the decisions about money in a system that is one country, one vote. And so that's similar to the UN Tax Convention I was speaking about, compared to where a lot of the rules have been is in systems like the OECD or the World Bank, where the global north really has a really outsized say. And so I think that kind of push for a more democratic decision-making is really key backbone to this as well.
Among the developing world that would greatly benefit from climate finance are islands that depend on the oceans, which they use for food and livelihood.
That's why recent news on the UN's High Seas Treaty is an excellent development. By the way, the HST is, among many things, meant to be the planet's first legally binding deal to safeguard marine life in international waters and to fairly share the benefits of the ocean's genetic resources. I called Jessica Battle, who is the World Wildlife Fund's Senior Global Ocean Governance and Policy Expert.
Hi, Jessica. So what does this treaty becoming legal in January 2026 really mean for the oceans?
So the High Seas Treaty is an incredibly important development for the ocean because it is a legally binding treaty. And so when it enters into force, all the countries that have become parties to the treaty, who have ratified it into their laws, will have to obey by the rules of the treaty. And in particular for the ocean, this means the establishment of marine protected areas on the high seas, which has not been able to be done before in a way that has been acceptable at an international level by states. And also, very importantly, all new activities have to undergo an environmental impact assessment process. It doesn't mean that every activity will need to go through a full-blown environmental impact assessment, which is a big exercise, but they all have to be assessed if they are seen to potentially cause harm to the marine environment, then they will have to be assessed as such. And then, if that is the case, there has to be regulations on how these activities can proceed, if at all. So, for example, for deep sea mining, this might be a big deal. So deep sea mining is regulated by an international body called the International Seabed Authority, which has oversight of deep sea mining. But deep sea mining has a lot of impacts beyond the deep sea floor. And here is where the High Seas Treaty comes in, and where the High Seas Treaty and the parties to the High Seas Treaty need to collaborate with the International Seabed Authority and make sure that if seabed mining is to go ahead, that it does not affect fisheries, for example, or the water column's ability to absorb carbon. And so there is going to be a lot more oversight over deep sea mining going forward through the fact that the treaty is entering into force. And that's really good news. It is not good if fisheries are managed just through fisheries agencies without adequate environmental oversight. The same thing for seabed mining and for shipping. So this treaty is putting together these various uses of the ocean with the environmental protection obligations that states have.
So will ships have new rules to follow?
Yes, also ships will have new rules to follow if ships are operating in such a way that they damage the marine environment or the species that live along their routes.
So which countries still haven't ratified? I mean, what's holding them back? Does their absence actually make a difference?
Well, first of all, we now have 61 countries who have ratified the treaty. I saw the last one coming on board was Ireland. So we're expecting more this week. The treaty really needs to have most, if not all, states parties because it's only then that all states are bound by it. But very importantly is that the states who have activities on the high seas are parties to the treaty. And at the moment, as you point out, not all of those states are parties to the treaty. So the United States, for example, are not. China are not. We will hopefully see them coming on board. Let's see how this unfolds.
What's holding them back, though?
In some cases, it's just that they want to see more of how this will affect their activities before they come on board. It's also sometimes just a question of how the legislative process in these countries work. It takes longer for some countries to go through the requisite processes in order for them to make new laws in their countries.
So how will marine areas that are far from land and far from oversight really be protected?
What will happen is that proposals for marine protected areas will be put forward by states who are parties to the treaty. And they can do this in collaboration, so groups of states can come together. They can do this together with scientists and with NGOs such as WWF or others. And at the moment this is happening, for example, Chile is probably the country which has the most far gone proposal so far. This then will have to come on a consulting phase. So it will have to go to the regional fisheries management organizations, to the International Maritime Organization, and to the International Seabed Authority, for example, for review and comments. Then it will come into the system of the treaty itself and go through a review by the scientific committee that will be set up under the treaty. And then finally, we'll come back to the Conference of the Parties for a decision. This protected area will be established here, these are the boundaries, and this is the management plan. So this management plan then goes back to the competent authorities that regulate shipping, mining, and fisheries, for them to decide, okay, this is a protected area, we have fishing here. We need to now decide how to regulate fishing to not impede on the conservation objectives of this area. So for example, if it's an area that's important for sharks, the fishing organization and the member states have to put in place measures that protect sharks in this area.
What happens if someone breaks the rules?
Yes, this is still to be discussed in terms of the severity of what the states would do. But there are options. The first option is just to have a conversation. It will be brought back to the Conference of the Parties by states who see that this isn't working. And there will be a discussion there about why is this not working. If that doesn't work, there is always the option to go to the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea to have a judgment about whether these activities are counter to the law of the sea and the BBNJ agreement. They don't want to counter international law, and they would like to collaborate. So it's really, the treaty is very much around making sure that states collaborate to the best possible extent. It's a positive admonition to collaborate. That is the basis of this treaty, I think, more than punishing states who are not complying.
So how do we balance protection with people whose livelihoods depend on the sea?
So in this case, that's pretty simple. First of all, there's very few states who actually have fishing activities on the high seas. And these are regulated through fisheries management organizations for the most part. There are some fisheries, like squid fisheries, for example, that are not managed at all at this point. And the fact is that many fish are migratory. They cross national and international boundaries. So they cross from the high seas into national waters. And they often spend the juvenile years in national waters, which is where people who rely on fish for the livelihoods and the health of the ocean live. And so by protecting areas that are important for these species in the high seas, you can actually help coastal livelihoods better.
And that's social. Some sweet treats, but not too many. $1 trillion demands from climate-hit nations and progress on a global treaty to protect the oceans. I hope you got something from this episode, anything that would greatly benefit you.
As I leave you, enjoy these waters. Until next time, bye.